Hello everyone. Let's get started. Today we're going to be talking about the integument. The word integument is simply the technical term for what most of us call the skin. The skin is the largest organ in the human body. In fact, it accounts for about 8% of your body weight. The thickness of the skin varies around different areas of the body, ranging from about 1.5 to about 4 millimeters or so in thickness. One of the most interesting features of the integument is that it contains all 4 of the tissue types that we have learned: epithelium, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nerve. The integument has a long list of different functions that it performs for the body, 6 in total. First and foremost, the skin offers protection. The skin is a protective barrier for traumatic injury to the internal tissues and organs of the body. The ability of the integument to provide this kind of protection, though, doesn't last forever. If you've ever known someone who is elderly, you know that the skin becomes more and more fragile as we age. Our skin starts off fragile when we're infants, but then develops into the protective layer that we have through most of our lives. In elderly people, the skin begins to thin, and because of that loss in thickness, it becomes more fragile and less able to provide that protective barrier. Now, in addition to just traumatic injury, the integument also protects against injury from chemicals. This is a really important part of what the integument does for us. We are exposed to all kinds of different molecules, from soaps and shampoos, cleaners, various oils, dirt, and other materials that are just out in the environment. And all of those different chemicals could be harmful to deeper tissues. But the skin provides an excellent layer of protection from that potential damage. The integument also protects against the entry of various pathogens into the deeper tissues of the body, where those pathogens could cause dangerous infections. Now, it's important to remember that the skin is covered in microorganisms, but those are the kinds of microorganisms that are either not harmful at all or even beneficial to us, and those are called the microbiome. The combination of the skin and the microbiome that covers it combine to protect against these more dangerous microbes from gaining entry. The normal pH of human skin also helps protect against the entry of pathogens. Adult human beings have a pH in the skin of about 5.7, so it's mildly acidic, and that mild acidity is something that pathogenic microbes can't deal with. It's harmful to them. The epithelial cells in the skin and some of the immune cells that reside in the skin also secrete certain chemicals that are harmful to pathogens. For example, there's a type of chemical called a defensin. It's a type of a protein that has natural antimicrobial properties. There's a second chemical called a dermcidin that is also antimicrobial. While the defensins are secreted by epithelial cells, and again, some immune cells, The dermcidins are actually secreted by some of the sweat glands in the skin. And the result is that these chemicals lie on the surface of the skin and help fight off these pathogenic microbes. Lastly, the integument protects against ultraviolet radiation that comes from the sun, reaching the deeper tissues of the body. Now, ultraviolet radiation, while it is quite dangerous, is limited in how much damage it can do because it has very poor penetration. Ultraviolet rays are only able to penetrate to about 2 millimeters of depth. So while the skin is susceptible to damage by UV light, and we'll talk more about that later in the lecture, the fact that the skin is there protects the deeper tissues from being exposed to ultraviolet radiation. There is a particular kind of cell in the integument called a melanocyte. And melanocytes secrete a pigment called melanin. And as you probably know, melanin is protective against some of this damage that can be caused by ultraviolet radiation. So, first and foremost, the skin, or the integument, is providing protection for the rest of the body. Second on the list of functions is the control of water balance. The skin is critical to maintaining a normal level of hydration in the body because it protects against the loss of fluid out into the environment through transpiration and sweating. The skin is actually quite water resistant, although it is not completely waterproof. If you've ever sat in a tub for too long or lazed around in a pool for too long, you know that your skin can soak up quite a bit of water and develop those sort of wrinkles that you can find on your fingers. So, water resistant, but not waterproof. One of the most striking examples of the role of the skin in controlling water balance can be seen in people who have been burned, people who have lost a significant amount of their integument through burn, are very vulnerable to death due to dehydration because the skin has been badly damaged or even removed in the burn. There is no longer any protection from water loss in those patients. We'll be talking more about burns later in the lecture. Third on the list of functions for the integument is two very important metabolic reactions. The first is the production of vitamin D, and the second is the metabolism of various topical drugs. The skin is one of the critical ways that the body obtains its vitamin D. There are cells in the skin called keratinocytes that, when they get exposed to ultraviolet radiation, are capable of producing a molecule called cholecalciferol, or what you and I would call vitamin D3. Vitamin D3 is actually the inactive form of vitamin D. It has to be taken through the liver and then through the kidneys in order to become activated into what's called calcitriol, or vitamin D1. It's also possible to get vitamin D through the diet, but exposure to about 15 minutes a day of sunlight is generally enough for a human being to produce an adequate amount of vitamin D in their skin. Vitamin D is involved in several metabolic reactions in the human body, particularly those that involve regulation of calcium and phosphorus levels. people who are deficient in vitamin D have a long list of symptoms. You may have heard of a disease of vitamin D deficiency called rickets. Rickets used to be quite a problem in this country, particularly in children, but that was before we started supplementing milk with vitamin D. Now, outside of the production of vitamin D, the integument is involved in the metabolism of various topical drugs. So these are the kinds of drugs that would be applied on the skin for absorption through the skin. In order for a drug to be absorbed into the skin, it has to be hydrophobic because there is a fair amount of oil or lipid material in the skin. Remember, the skin is largely water resistant because of all that oil. There are some drugs, though, that are hydrophobic in nature and can therefore be applied through the skin. There are cells inside the integument called keratinocytes that are the first cells to encounter those topical drugs and begin the process of metabolizing them. Fourth on the list of functions is immune function. Again, it seems strange to us that there is immune activity in a place like the skin, but there are immune cells that live outside of the bloodstream in various tissues. There's a cell called a Langerhans cell that lives in the skin, and its job is to attack any pathogens that may have gotten through the top layers of the skin. The fifth function of the integument is temperature regulation, and the skin plays a very important role in this. There are both sweat glands in the skin and an extensive network of capillaries that help in the regulation of body temperature. Remember from our discussion of temperature regulation as a negative feedback mechanism, we said that there are effectors in the stimulus response pathway that are responsible for causing changes in the body to alter the temperature in the opposite direction that it might be heading. So, for example, effectors like sweat glands and capillaries can help lower the body temperature if it's getting too high, and also raise the body temperature if it's getting too low. The most obvious of these is the sweat glands. Sweat glands produce sweat, and sweat, because it is a liquid, will help cause evaporative heat loss. So if the body is getting too warm, the sweat glands can release sweat and cause excessive heat to be lost, can cause temperature to come back down towards the normal range. If the body is getting too cold, then you would expect that the sweat glands would stop producing sweat in an effort to reduce evaporation and retain some heat. Now, the capillary network in the skin is found in a very particular region known as the dermis. We'll be talking about the dermis in just a couple of minutes. This capillary network lies very close to the surface of the body, and so it can play a big role in either helping to lose excessive heat or retain heat. For example, when blood capillaries are constricted, that will help the body retain heat. When those capillaries dilate, that will help heat be lost. There's another player in the dermis that you may not think about it right away, but there are what are known as arrector pili muscles. These are the small muscles in the integument that when they contract, raise up the hair follicles. This is what we more commonly refer to as getting goosebumps. When the erector pili muscles contract, they actually generate a little bit of heat. So they too are involved in the control of temperature in the human body. The last function of the integument is sensory reception. There's a particular kind of cell in the integument called a Merkel cell. And Merkel cells are known as tactile cells because they are sensitive to and capable of responding to touch or pressure. Merkel cells are simply specialized epithelial cells. And what happens when they are activated through touch and pressure is that they secrete neurochemicals that will then go on to send that message of touch and pressure through the nervous system to the control center, the brain and the spinal cord. So the integument is not only the largest organ in the body, but it's an organ that has multiple functions, 6 different critical functions to help maintain the health of the human body. You cannot survive without your skin. We're going to begin now to discuss the integument in terms of its structural anatomy. The first thing to know is that there are 2 distinct layers in the integument. There's what's referred to as the epidermis. That's the part of the integument that's closest to the surface. And then below that, a second layer called the dermis. Now, both the epidermis and the dermis are stratified, in other words, layered with different types of cells. It's also important to know that in addition to the epidermis and the dermis, there are various other accessory structures in the integument. There are hair follicles and hairs coming out of them. There are fingernails and toenails, those erector pili muscles I mentioned a minute ago. There are all kinds of glands in the integument. Those include sweat glands, sebaceous glands, ceruminous glands, and of course mammary glands. And finally, the cardiovascular system is present in the integument in the form of arteries and veins and that extensive capillary network. Now I want to say just a word about glands here because there's some new terminology for us with regards to glands that are in the integument. When it comes to sweat glands, or what are more technically known as sudoriferous glands, those 2 words mean the same thing. There are actually 2 varieties in the skin. There are eccrine sweat glands and apocrine sweat glands. Eccrine sweat glands are the most abundant type of sweat glands across the body. Eccrine sweat glands produce a watery sweat that has very little odor associated with it. In comparison, apocrine sweat glands are limited in their distribution around the body. You find apocrine sweat glands associated with areas such as the armpits and the groin. Apocrine sweat glands produce a much more viscous sweat, and it has a very distinct bad odor. The other difference is that eccrine sweat glands secrete sweat directly onto the surface of the skin, generally for the purpose of temperature regulation, whereas apocrine sweat glands secrete sweat into the hair follicle. Now, sebaceous glands are the kinds of glands that produce an oily secretion, and like apocrine sweat glands, Sebaceous glands will secrete their oil into the hair follicle. Ceruminous glands actually secrete a waxy material. They are quite abundant in your ear canal. That's where your earwax comes from. So, a variety of different glands in the integument producing different types of secretions. Now, underneath the integument, there is a layer that's important for us to know. It's what we refer to as the hypodermis. So remember, from the surface of the skin, we first encounter the epidermis, then the dermis. That's the extent of the integument. Below the integument is the hypodermis. Now, the hypodermis is also very commonly referred to as subcutaneous tissue. And this subcutaneous tissue, or below the skin tissue, contains loose connective tissue of two kinds, both the areolar variety and adipose, and it also contains an abundance of sensory neurons. On this slide, we're looking at a drawing of a section of both integument and hypodermis, or subcutaneous tissue. This represents the surface of the skin that would be exposed to the outside world. And then as you come down, you travel through the different layers until finally you get into the subcutaneous layer. So if we start at the top here, the first layer of the integument is epidermis. And you'll notice that the epidermis is significantly thinner than the next layer, which is the dermis. So from here down to here, that would represent dermis. And then we get into the subcutaneous, or hypodermis. So let's begin with the outermost layer of the integument, or the epidermis. The epidermis is a stratified epithelial tissue. So it's a layered tissue that has all of the characteristics that we've discussed of epithelial tissue. The most abundant type of cell that we're going to see in the epidermis is a cell called the keratinocyte. Now, this specialized type of epithelial cell gets its name because it produces a protein called keratin. Now, keratin is a very fibrous protein. It's very tough and it's insoluble. So it helps contribute to that water-resistant nature of the integument. Keratinocytes are actually produced very frequently in the epidermis, and they're produced from a type of cell known as a stem cell. Down at the bottom layer of the epidermis, these stem cells are rapidly dividing. Recall that the epidermis renews itself about once a day, so new cells are produced about once every 24 hours. These stem cells get their name because they have a very unique ability when it comes to cell division. Stem cells are cells that don't really have an identity of their own. They're immature, in other words. They haven't yet committed to being any one particular type of cell in the body. When a stem cell divides, it produces two new cells. One of those is going to be a new stem cell. The other one is going to be a cell that will mature and become a specific type of cell in the human body. In this case, a keratinocyte. So one of the fascinating things about stem cells is that they renew themselves. When stem cells divide, they make a replacement for themselves, a new stem cell, and they make a cell that's going to go on and become something specific in the human body. So keratinocytes arise from these stem cells in the bottom layer of the epidermis. Now, it's going to take a brand new keratinocyte about 2 weeks to travel from that low stem cell layer all the way up through the other layers of the epidermis until it reaches the very top. It takes about 2 weeks for that cell to make that journey. Once it gets to the top, it'll spend about 2 weeks there. And then it will be let go, it will be lost, it will be shed into the environment. When you look around the different areas of the human body, there is some variation in the thickness of the epidermis. Most of the body is what we would refer to as thin skin. And by thin, we mean up to about 0.15 millimeters in depth. So very thin, just a fraction of a millimeter. There are 2 places on the body that are covered in thick skin. And in thick skin, the epidermis is up to about 0.6 millimeters in thickness. Thick skin is only found on the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. All the rest of your skin is considered thin skin. Now we're going to talk about these layers that exist in the epidermis. Thick skin actually has 5 individual layers. And thick skin only has one of those accessory structures that we've talked about. It only has sweat glands in it. Thin skin is different. Thin skin has 4 individual layers, and it contains lots of accessory structures: hair follicles and hair, the arrector pili muscles, sweat glands, sebaceous glands, and fingernails and toenails. In this slide, we're looking at a drawing of thin versus thick skin. If you start over on the right-hand side, this is a representation of thin skin. Again, the kind of skin that covers most of the human body. Now, take a look at this line of cells right here, the dark cells. This represents the border between the 2 layers of the integument, the epidermis up on the top and the dermis down below. That same dark line of cells can be seen over here on the left, right here. So this is epidermis and this is dermis. Now, what that means is that the difference between thin and thick skin lies in the epidermis and in the thickness of the different layers of the epidermis. Don't worry about these names, but just look at how the artist has drawn the different cells. That dark line of cells here, then there's a layer of cells here, then there's a dark sort of black layer of cells here, and another layer on top. When you go over to the left to the thick skin, you can see that this top layer is much thicker. These black sort of flattened out cells are much thicker over here. There's even an extra layer of cells in the thick skin, an extra layer of a type of cell in the thick skin that's not found in the thin skin. So you only find this thick skin on the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet.